Welcome everyone. Today's video is going to cover two different topics, but two topics that are related to one another. The two topics are called subdivide and subdivision surface. And what we're going to do today is use subdivide and subdivision surface to give us a little bit more freedom when it comes to editing meshes. It's going to give us finer points of control over our shape. So I'm going to start by deleting my cube here. And I am going to create a plane in the middle of our 3D base. Let's add a plane. That looks good. Now, the goal of what I'm trying to do today is I want to create a scene where I've got a flat ground and then two pillars coming up out of the ground. The first thing I want to do is make a plane that's large enough to hold our scene. If I check out my camera view right now, I can see that this plane isn't very large. So I'm going to go ahead, scale this guy out a ways, right about to the edge of my surface. Now, one thing that we haven't talked about a lot in class, but is always an option to us, if we didn't want to scale that way, we could go to our object properties, which is this little golden cube here. And if I select the object properties, you'll notice that I have values for scale. Right now, my scale is set to 1. That means that my plane is 1 unit large. If I want this to be 8 times bigger, then I could set my scale values to 8. And that'll make my plane 8 times larger than it was. So I'm going to do that for now. And remember that the problem that we're trying to solve here is creating two pillars that come up out of plane. Now, normally, based on what we've learned so far, we might take a couple of cubes, right, and put a cube or two in here. And then once we've got the cube where we want it, we might extrude the cube to make a tower, and then we might duplicate it or something like that. But that doesn't really work for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that positioning the cube will be very difficult. Let's say we want one pillar to be here and one pillar to be here. To be able to get the space that we want in relation to the plane, it's going to be a little challenging. Not to mention that orienting our cube within the plane is a little sloppy. We want to have a little bit more fine-tuned control over how our towers come up out of the plane. So to do that, we are going to chop the plane up using the Subdivide tool. So the Subdivide tool is a tool that allows us to take a face and chop it up into smaller faces. So it's really, really good for when we have something like a plane that normally only has a single face. So if we go into edit mode, oh, I'm in the wrong view. If we go into edit mode right now and we go to face select, we can see that this plane only has one face, just one giant face. And I want to chop this face into smaller faces so that I can start extruding towers out of our plane. And we do that by using the Subdivide tool. So the Subdivide tool, I'm going to talk about subdivision surface in a second, but the Subdivide tool we find in our tools window along with everything else. And the tricky thing about Subdivide, notice that it's not here right now. That's because, oh, actually it is here. Here it is. Good. All right. So if we select Subdivide, let's watch what happens. Our face now becomes 4 faces. So it's kind of like when you evenly fold a piece of paper and then you unfold the paper and there's a bunch of creases. Whoa, I do not want to undo. And there's 4 even spaces on our paper. That's exactly what we're doing. Subdivide, again, is going to chop it up again, and we'll do one more. So the more times we subdivide, the more faces that we can pull out of or interact with on our plane. So now I'm going to go into my camera view. I'm going to say that I want these towers here and here. So now it's as simple as extruding the 2 pillars that I want to come out of my plane. So subdivision allows us to change a shape without adding new shapes. So we can add or remove stuff from a face without having to worry about interacting with different shapes. A lot of you guys asked me about joining shapes and partitioning shapes. We don't have to worry about that here, right? We're dealing with one thing, one single plane. So a lot of times if we want to create a larger scene, we actually start with a single mesh like this. We start with a plane. And then we start extruding from that plane the separate pieces that we want. The really cool thing about Subdivide is that it works on any face. So now, let's say I want to start making a balcony that comes out here. I can go to this face and subdivide it a couple of times. So let's see, let's subdivide it once, twice, and let's select only these faces and subdivide again. Now, I'm going to take these guys. I'm going to get this one. And I am going to extrude them. And now you can see that I'm already starting to morph my shape into something completely different from what I started with. And remember that these faces don't show up outside of edit mode. So even though I can see, even though I never do anything with these other faces, it's just going to look like one smooth surface when I'm all done. The faces are only there to give me other points to interact with. If I wanted to, I could extrude this guy. I could extrude this guy some more. And we're starting to get very different shapes just by subdividing and extruding different parts of our plane. Remember that right now this is still just one plane. This started as a plane, and it's all one part of the object. The tricky thing about working this way is that once we subdivide, remember that materials are object specific, right? So if I add a plane or a material to this plane, it's going to be for everything. So if I want, let's say, the balcony to be a different color from everything else, then I need to make sure I partition. I'm going to show what that looks like really quick. So I'm just using C select here to be able to select a bunch of faces at once. Select, and I'm going to use shift click to get rid of this one. All right, that all looks good. I'm going to hit shift click to let go of that one. So now, remember that we have the P shortcut to partition. I think that's in our shortcut here. P to partition. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to partition the selection. And now if I wanted to, I could deal with this separately, right? So I could color this part, get it looking the way I wanted, and then if I wanted to, I could stick it back together. Or if I just wanted this little cube area to be its own thing, then I could circle select this guy and partition it as well. So it's important once we've subdivided to make sure that we separate the objects that need to be separated. So now I'm starting to actually get distinct objects that I could color or make transparent or apply textures to. Whatever it may be, after I've done my subdividing and my extruding, I need to make sure that I separate things that need to be separated. You guys are going to be doing something like this in your activity for class tomorrow, where you're going to create a city skyline that is going to incorporate some buildings that you extrude out of a plane. All right, good. So I want to talk really briefly about the subdivision surface modifier. So what we've learned about so far is the subdivide tool. The more times I click it, the more times it divides a face. Subdivision surface is meant to smooth out flat areas. So it's supposed to evenly divide and round off edges and faces. And the reason that this is different is because instead of subdividing a single face, we're going to see it look like it crumples or collapses an object. I'm actually going to add that to the notes. Appears to crumple an object. And subdivision surface, just like Boolean, is a modifier. So let's add a cube. So we've got a cube floating around in our 3D space. And notice that there's nothing round about a cube, right? A cube is flat on the top and on the sides, and it has corners and straight lines. I want to apply a subdivision surface modifier to this cube so that I can collapse it. So remember that when we applied a Boolean modifier, we did that using the wrench, right? This is our modifiers tab. So I'm going to go ahead and use my wrench to add a subdivision surface modifier. That there? So up here is where Boolean was. We're going to use subdivision surface. And immediately, our cube becomes this odd, almost round shape. So our cube has been crumpled into a smaller shape. Now, what's interesting about this, however, why is this useful, right? We have a sphere shape. Why would we ever need to make a crumpled cube? What's neat is that if we go into edit mode, I'm in edit mode right now, the shape in edit mode is still a cube. So if I move this side, it changes what my subdivided surface looks like. I'm kind of morphing this thing without actually having to interact with all of the vertices. It's using a simpler shape to modify a more complex shape. If I do this by faces, we can flatten out our shape. That there? So I'm using it to create this flat, crumpled look. I'm going to elongate it a little bit, something like that. So now I've drastically altered the shape of this thing without actually having to interact with this many edges and vertices. I'm using what's called subdivision surface. So I'm using a simpler shape to make a more complex shape. Now if I click apply and go into edit mode, now that I've applied the shape, it now has all the edges and faces that I can work with individually. What's really neat about subdivision surface is that just like subdivide, I can apply the modifier more than once. More modifiers means a smoother object. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to add another subdivision surface modifier. Notice now that my shape is getting much more round, right? And if I go into edit mode, I'll see that even though my shape is getting more complex, the simpler version is still there. Let's see if I get this. So now if I were to morph this guy, I can see that it's morphing the more complex shape, even though I'm modifying the simpler shape, just like when it was a cube. And then if I click apply again, now I've got a more complex shape to deal with. And I can keep adding subdivision surface until this thing is as smooth and as finely detailed as I want it to be. The one I want to highlight for you guys, because you're also going to be making something like this in class if you finish the skyline, is how we can create something that actually looks almost pumpkin-like. So in our video here, we are going to create a cylinder, and we're going to add a subdivision surface modifier. Now this looks pretty weird, right? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to select the top of the cylinder and flatten this guy out just a little bit, kind of like that, make him a little fat. And I'm going to apply. Now this is looking really jagged around the edges. If I subdivide a cone only once, it leaves a bunch of these little sharp teeth marks, almost like a gear. So I want to subdivide the surface again. And now I'm starting to smooth out some of these upper edges. And finally, I'm going to subdivide the surface a third time. We're starting to get something that looks almost pumpkin-like. And that's what we're looking for. If we wanted to now, if we go into our surface, we can see that there's all kinds of faces and edges for us to select, and vertices. So we can get much more fine-grained control over what we do with this shape. Now, I'm sure that you can start to guess what we're going to be making in class if we're creating something that is pumpkin-shaped. But our primary objective of this lesson is to make sure that we can use the Subdivide tool. So subdivision surface is a cool extra, but Subdivide the tool, which is, let's see here. This guy is much more useful to us. This is the guy that's going to let us create more vertices where we need them and give us a lot more fine-grained control over our shapes. That work. Subdivide. Right here. Because I extruded? Or is my blender glitching? That could be a problem. Yep. Alright, something's happening there. Hopefully we won't see that in your Blender projects. Hopefully we'll get a nice subdivided plane like this. But remember, the goal of Subdivide, ignore that little hiccup, the goal of Subdivide is to be able to create more faces where only a single face exists. So tomorrow, you guys are going to be creating some of these towers yourself. Keep in mind that subdivision surface is a neat tool, but really we just treat it as an extra. We're not going to use subdivision surface nearly as much in this class as we use Subdivide. But both of them we will put to practice tomorrow. Thanks for watching.